And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happenstance in this incredible dialogue. I am so grateful to be joined by someone I like to think of as a friend, but someone I have had the great fortune of interacting with as a result of kind of our collective interest in work. And the gentleman that is beside me is none other than the great Paul Jay, a man who is a multifaceted talent. When I first came into knowing your work was with, I believe it was the real news that you were broadcasting from Baltimore because you were engaged with obviously someone I've worked with for some time, the legendary William K. Black. But I do know you go back and forth, of course, to Toronto, absolutely wonderful city. And you also broadcast the real news in
Oh,
addition to
no,
being,
no, no. Now I do the analysis dot news.
I, how about that? That's what I meant to say. I apologize. The analysis dot news, very important distinction. And but you're also a filmmaker. And the last time we spoke, it was approximately 3 years, Paul, 3 years ago, Paul. And you were just getting ready to kind of go down the path of a documentary about legendary Daniel Eis. I was about to say Eisenberg, but it's Daniel Ellsberg.
That's
Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg and his incredible story. And I want to talk about that at length. But I think I want to start off with just kind of a temperature gauge because some things have happened really, I mean, nonstop since our last discussion, but really in the past couple of weeks that dramatized really your effort over the course of the last many, many years. What is your priority at the moment? Like when you think of a hierarchy of things that you want to address, what is it?
well. It's I'm working on the film. It's not really about Ellsberg. It's titled "How to Stop a Nuclear War," and it's based on Dan Ellsberg's book "Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner." But it's not a bio of Ellsberg. He's sort of our one of our main voices. But the film is about what it says. What are concrete measures that could be taken to reduce the risk of nuclear war? And there's a few which we can talk about later. But the question is, why aren't we? And what we pose at the beginning is something I don't think anybody can argue with, which is the risk of nuclear war, especially accidental miscalculation, error. The risk of that causing nuclear war is far from zero. And nobody can say it's zero, and I don't think anybody can deny it's far from zero. So if that's the case, then how come we're not even talking about it? Never mind doing something about it. So that's my main focus. But in terms of doing trying to answer that question, one of the important things we're doing is unpacking the Cold War. Because the Cold War assumptions, the primary assumption being uh, America fights for freedom and these terrible either dictatorships or autocracies are out to get us, that fundamental Cold War story has not changed. And so to some extent, we're doing the history of that and trying to get at the truth of that so we can better understand today. But we're also within that is why was there a Cold War? And then you get to the question, which the answer is that right from the beginning, and I mean pretty well almost day one of the United States, you had a process unfolding of the militarization of the United States. It was founded in a violent suppression of indigenous people. It was founded in the extremely violent system of slavery. And then over time, as the Industrial Revolution developed, both of those things became more and more financialized. The banks, Wall Street, started playing a critical role in both plantation culture, the cotton trade, and the westward expansion and the stealing of land from indigenous people. So if you want, a lot of people, when they talk about nuclear weapons and a history, they start the Manhattan Project as it somehow just popped up out of nowhere. And they don't want to discuss the historical context that gave rise to the Manhattan Project. Like one of the questions we want to answer answer is, when they knew there was no German nuclear bomb, why'd they keep building a bomb? And that's probably sometime in 1943 they know that there's no German bomb. So the film is going to, begin with the current risk, but to understand the current situation, we're going to go back to understand the roots of this system and class that runs this country and other countries, but we're focusing more on the US, that's willing to risk the apocalypse in order to make money.
Based on control, which I think when you first introduced the concept and the context, I was thinking to myself, oh, all based on a lie, right? Because it's always been this incredible, like it says behind me, the American dream, right? Some sort of propaganda and this mythologizing that dynamism and self-reliance and, the edicts of being able to see a need, fill a need, create dynamism for people to fulfill that sort of role. And to a degree it has, but I think the overwhelming evidence throughout our country's history is what you had mentioned. And what I also jumped to was thinking about Oppenheimer, obviously, in the more recent depiction of it, of course, played by Cillian Murphy. But that was the whole virtue of his being able to go the distance at the end, where he was kind of considered an enemy of the state because he asked those questions, did he not?
Well, I don't think he ever asked any of the fundamental questions.
Not the fundamental. Why did we drop the bomb? If that was the question that I thought he asked.
Well, not really, because he was all for it.
Okay, well then I bought into the sort of Hollywood depiction of it. But
well,
okay,
even in the Hollywood depiction, but the truth was even more. Oppenheimer was very much in favor of showing the world the bomb worked. He may have believed in this cockamamie idea that if you showed it work, it would be so horrible, no one would ever want to use it again. But he was for it. He was actually in on picking the targets. And the Leo Szilard, who was one of the scientists based in Chicago, but he was a very important part of the Manhattan Project, he and some others circulated a petition that was supposed to go to to Truman, and to not drop the bomb on people, that if you have to prove the bomb works, do it on some deserted island. And Oppenheimer did not sign the petition. In fact, he kind of didn't even show it to he gave it to Groves, and Groves never gave it to Truman. So no, Oppenheimer is not he comes off as a somewhat conflicted person in the film Oppenheimer, and I guess he was, because he used to be a lefty.
now, also, I was going to say thank you for the clarification, because as you were rolling through that, I'm remembering all of the nuances, and I'm like, oh, okay, I could see where that went, because you're very accurate in what you just responded to.
Later, he took a better position when it came to the hydrogen bomb. He came out against the hydrogen bomb, and that was good, because the hydrogen bomb is the thing that puts all of human civilization at risk. And it was more of a debate, more of an open debate, whether to develop the hydrogen bomb. It wasn't done as much in secret as the Manhattan Project was, although it's far less secret than people claim it was, which we can talk about. But once he came out against the hydrogen bomb, and this isn't what's clear in the film, and it should have been, this is why he was ostracized and sidelined. Because of his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. And he basically was marginalized after that.
Well, thank you again. And I appreciate that, because now my mind is like in the right space. I was like, what was I missing about that? But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when I was reading right before I did the introduction, Paul, I didn't realize that you had also, I think, co-director, helped facilitate or develop Hot Docs. We were my team after we made our sizzle. I had the great fortune to go to Toronto and visit and be a part of Hot Docs, which was an absolutely amazing experience. What an event. I think one of the greatest documentary film festivals that exist in the world. So bravo to you. It was actually before we got into the pilot and made the series. But I thought that was interesting that you had done that and that you've been doing this your whole career. But I want to circle back to something that really I thought absolutely blew my mind. Now, I've been following you for years, and I think nobody has done better coverage that exists on 9/11 and the families of 9/11 and what you've done regarding Bob Graham and the 9/11 Commission and all of the other elements that you've brought to the table for years. And it's 2025, and of course on Thursday there was an incredible revelation, not revelation, but a moment that after all of these years, there was a judge that had approved that the families could now sue Saudi Arabia. I'm curious how you responded to that when you saw that news, or you were probably made aware of it ahead of time.
No, I'm not in touch with any of the families now. I was back many years ago, but not now. Well, I'm glad the judge decided that. But the thing that hit me just recently, 60 Minutes recently just did a piece on the 9/11 lawsuit, and they discovered a couple of boxes of FBI materials and that had been sitting in a warehouse that were never turned over to the 9/11 Commission, or at least so the 9/11 Commission guy they interviewed claims, and maybe probably true. And it's, this suggests that there's been a cover up of the Saudi role and so on, as if they're discovering something. But in the CBS piece, they never mentioned Bob Graham once, or the joint congressional investigation into 9/11, or the 28 redacted pages that finally mostly got unredacted, which were a complete exposure of the Saudi role. And not one mention in the CBS report. And nobody talks about Bob Graham and the Joint Congressional Committee anymore, because Graham, in his interviews with me, and as far as I know, I'm the only one where he said this on camera, but he said it several times, and it's all out there, it's all public. Graham said to me in no uncertain terms that, number one, Bush Cheney knew something was coming. Two, they manipulated the intelligence so that it would go to Cheney and bypass Richard Clarke, who was the anti-terrorism czar, and that Cheney sat on it. But it didn't. When I asked him, well, so you mean he deliberately disorganized the intelligence agencies? And he said, yes, but it's more than that. They facilitated, which I thought was remarkable. He went that far. And then he gave me several examples of how they actually facilitated the attacks. One being, well, everyone knows, not everyone, people that follow this know that 30, 40 or something of members of the bin Laden family that were in the United States were put on a plane flying back to Saudi Arabia. Even supposedly the skies were closed to commercial aircraft. But more than that, this is one of the things that's most explosive, that's completely ignored. Now, I let me just say this ahead of time. I don't know if everything Graham says is true. I have no way to independently verify. But Bob Graham was not only the former governor of Florida, he was the co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee for years. This is a real insider of American intelligence. So when he's saying this stuff, at the very least, you take it seriously, you investigate it. So
he was the co-director of the 9/11 Commission, was he not?
There's two commissions.
Okay.
There's the 9/11, sort of the one everyone knows about. This is the one that came about under pressure from 9/11 families. Bush wasn't going to investigate anything, but the 9/11 families were so furious about what had happened and all some of the stuff that was coming out. They insisted on having this commission, and this is the one that said it was a failure of intelligence. Essentially, it was Keystone Cops, the various agencies bumping into each other, and they can't talk to each other, and that's why it happens. Well, Bob Graham, using my words, says that's all bullshit. He says that Cheney Bush deliberately disorganized the intelligence agencies, that the intelligence was, and Thomas Drake makes this point, former NSA guy. The intelligence bypassed Richard Clarke, went directly to Cheney. Cheney sits on it. And for example, when the presidential briefing, bin Laden plans to attack America. Now, this did come out. It's on television during the coverage of the hearings, not the Joint Congressional Committee, the 9/11 Investigative Committee, two different things. The televised one is this 9/11 Commission. During those hearings, Condoleezza Rice is asked, you got a memo from I guess it's from the CIA, and it says bin Laden plans to attack America. Don't you think you do something when you get that memo? What happened? And she says, no, we thought it was some historical document. I mean, total nonsense. Anyway, Bob Graham tells me it's way past that. The normal protocol after a presidential briefing is something called a principals briefing. It goes out within a day or two of the presidential briefing. Heads of agencies, secretaries, undersecretaries. This is to alert people that might have to do something. Like you get a briefing saying bin Laden plans to attack America, and maybe the FAA does something, maybe the immigration department can do something. Anyway, the next principals briefing, it's not there. And Graham says to me, someone has to deliberately decide not to put that memo from the CIA in the principals briefing, because there's just no way it would not normally be there. He gave that as an example of facilitation. Another example he gave me is the White House ordered the immigration department to let every Saudi person into the country, period. And one immigration guy in Florida didn't read the memo, let a Saudi in who the Graham's investigators believe was going to be one of the people on the planes, and actually got hell for having not read the memo. There's several other things like that. If people want, it's all up on my on the analysis website. So the key thing here is that not only have they ignored Graham, but I myself emailed every major news organization in the country and told them what Graham had just told me on camera, and I offered them my interview footage for free. I said, all you got to do is credit me for doing the interview. Not one answer, not one reply. I knew somebody in one of the major newsrooms. I'd worked with him, and I phoned him. And I started with, Bob Graham, serious guy, right? Yeah. Co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Not co-chair, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Not a nut, right? No, serious guy, blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay, listen to what he just told me, and I got it on camera, and you can have it. He says, holy shit, I'll get right back to you. Never heard from him again.
I love to hear you say that. I'm so glad you've reset that story for my audience's ears and anybody who will discover this. And, you know, it follows the trajectory that I think a lot of us can obviously see play out in real time right now. Tomorrow, we're going to see, I think, the victims of the Epstein scenario conglomerate and, you know, speak their truth. And many of them, of course, as we've seen from everything that's transpired over the course of the last several months, since I might call him, you know, everybody called him, everybody has a nickname for Donald Trump. Mine is the Mad Magazine Mad King. All of it is so ridiculous, considering everything that would happen with Kash Patel and Bongino and the whole Pam Bondi nature of the cover up by way of, you know, there's nothing to see here, you know, with Trump, with 15 years of being involved with Epstein. But the continuity here is that all of these people that were victims were going to the mainstream media as early as long before Epstein got arrested, and everybody ignored him. And in our work, the con, you know, what always blew my mind was when we started, but actually before I move into that, I just want to make the quick connection though. As all of this stuff is starting to unfold, we start to see things like relationships with Bear Stearns. If you go back in the Wayback Machine with Donald Trump, you can find Triad real estate development with none other than Adnan Khashoggi and everything that leads to. That's pre all of these elements. But there's this incredible continuity with the media that it does not tell huge important stories in a very systemic way, because that's the whole reason we had to tell the con. And what I found out when we were starting to go down the pathway of the con, just like you explored, with Condoleezza Rice, and of course, all of the major players that Bob Graham, said were actually demonstrably engaged with what appears to be misdirection. That's all about asymmetric information. For the 2008 great financial crisis, there were literally thousands of high-level executives. We've got the story of the top level guys that were blaring the story to the world of what was coming down the pike, and everybody ignored it. And what happens in the aftermath of the largest, financial meltdown since the Great Depression? Crickets. We make the entire story quashed, and we're still in the midst of it. Interestingly enough, we're re-releasing it, I think, in a couple of weeks. Some news to come. But that being said, I mean, that goes back to where, I mean, there's this continuity, and I've heard you talk about it, but I want to try to get you to unpack this from a standpoint of, I know there's a lot of important issues to you, such as Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, the, let's say, billionaire oligarchic network throughout the world, obviously everything that we continue to see that repeats itself this decade. And I swear, when you see the convergence of Saudi's influence, right, not to mention everything else that's kind of come down the pike, I'm curious if it ever, in your analysis and your discussions and all of the rest, if you start to deconstruct this stuff from the global paradigm of energy and also the world, well, until we'll see what happens with the why can't I think of the group of I mean, we're in a situation where the dollar, the world's reserve currency, has been predicated on kind of a global paradigm of oil. And why can't I get my head around what I'm trying to say, what the nation's moving forward, trying to break out of the dollar dominance, so to speak? It'll come to me in a minute, but that's enough. I mean, how do you unpack that in terms of what you know? Because you've seen this for the last 25 years.
Well, let me go back to where I was before, because I'm trying to get this story from the beginning, because everything that happens from the development of the Industrial Revolution is playing itself out today, and in some way there's nothing new. Well, there's one big thing that's new, and that's the digital revolution, but we'll get there in a second. What happens in the Civil War is the South needs to, obviously wants to maintain slavery, but you have to get the size of the slave economy. If you take the slaves as assets and put a value on them, in something like mid 1800s, the value of the slaves was 3 times the value of every factory, every railroad, and every bank. That's the size of how much slavery meant to the US economy. And who was sort of steering this? Well, of course, you had the plantation owner aristocracy, but the key linchpin in the whole thing was Wall Street. Wall Street was the middleman for selling cotton to the England. And by the way, the cotton from the slave plantations was what drove the Industrial Revolution in England. So this was such a major economic force. People don't get the scale of it. And so while Wall Street was sort of in the pre-Industrial Revolution period, completely wrapped up with slave culture, as the Industrial Revolution developed, they saw there's more money to be made out of wage slavery, industrial labor, and pushing west. So now you start getting this conflict in the elites, with Wall Street completely leading the charge here. And it becomes JP Morgan becomes the guy. And they could live with slavery. It's not like there was a real abolitionist movement, but the bankers, and for even Lincoln for some time, they could have worked it out and left a certain part of the country as slavery if Wall Street and northern commercial mercantile money could dominate. And number two, it would be the industrial capital that would open up the West, because they wanted railroads, they wanted land for settlers, because settlers mean towns, and towns mean with farms. You get the fund loan money to farms for agriculture. You loan money to build railroads. You loan money to build towns, and eventually you get the railroads to the West Coast, and you control sending cotton to China and to Asia. So the westward expansion was one of the, maybe even the reason, but one of the main reasons for the Civil War. And the South, of course, wanted the West, because guess what? You can only use the same land for so long for cotton, and otherwise the soil won't grow cotton anymore. So they wanted to move west because they needed to move the plantations west. Also, the numbers of African slaves were getting so big that in certain areas of the South, it was 3-to-1 black slaves versus whites. And so, at some point, you may not be able to control these people. So anyway, you can get more into it, but the point I'm getting at is when you look at these things, it's these objective economic, even geographical factors that have to be looked at. But here's the point here, and there's lots more you can say, but who finances the Union Army? The banks, J.P. Morgan. They get the deal with Lincoln. They're going to float bonds. They're going to make money selling bonds. They're going to make money buying bonds and earning interest, and they got all their money back. And it goes on from there. You start the sort of financialization of war, the discovery of, wow, war profiteering's really good. They discovered that in the Civil War. Maybe it wasn't in the beginnings, but as they got into it. And get this one. In the midst of the Civil War, J.P. Morgan owns a company that buys several thousand old crappy rifles from the Union Army for around $2 a piece. And then the company does minor fix-ups on the rifles and sells them back to the Union Army for something like $22 a rifle. This shit goes back right to the beginnings. And so the process of financialization of the economy, in other words, the big banks controlling, and number two, militarization. They go hand in hand. And so you can trace this up into the First World War. There's something most people have never heard of. I only heard of it recently. In 1934, something called the Nye Committee. It was a congressional committee, a guy named Senator Nye from North Dakota. And they're trying to answer the question, why did the United States join World War I? And their official findings, it's in the record, it's in their document, in their final statements. The principal reason was lobbying by the arms industry, but even more important, because Wilson had run in the election against joining the war, J.P. Morgan had big loans out to England and France. And he wanted to make sure those loans got repaid, and he pushed Wilson to go to war to make sure his loans got repaid. Now this is not some weird theory. This is the actual finding of the Senate committee led by Nye. Now that committee's findings got buried. There was news for a while, and then the whole thing went away. Let me take one more step. This is all stuff that's going to be in the film, but this next one, hardly anyone's heard of. So one of the obviously big families that emerges from this whole process is Rockefellers. Standard Oil, obviously, is the fuel, literally, of the Industrial Revolution. The Rockefellers in 1921 create something called the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, in 1939, Rockefeller gets their Council on Foreign Relations, makes a deal with FDR and the State Department to plan the world. How is this world going to look like when the war is over? This all sounds like conspiracy stuff, except it's all documented. This is in the CFR documents. Somebody wants later that I can tell you what book it is that has the actual documents in it. I'm not saying anything that isn't documented. So even though it sounds batshit crazy, it is unfortunately the real history. So the CFR makes a deal with the State Department on behalf of the Rockefellers, and the CFR members are people like the Dulles brothers. I mean, all the major players of people that become the Truman administration, and some of the key players from FDR's administration, they create a secret committee, secret, of 100 academics and businessmen who are going to plan the post-World War II world. Now, I mean, it's interesting. In 41, they thought the war would end like World War I ended. In other words, Germany would still exist as a power, Japan would still be a power, and there'd be these blocks in the Great Area. There'd be 4 blocks. The German bloc would still have some of Europe. The Soviet bloc would be the Soviet Union with some of Europe, maybe. The Japanese bloc would have Asia and probably China. There'd be the British bloc, which would really be a junior partner to the American bloc, and Americans get everything else. But they weren't just, this wasn't, what did it mean by bloc? Because all of the blocs, except for the Soviet bloc, were going to be part of the same financial architecture. Now, as you get into 1942, 43, CFR and others, they understand, oh no, we're actually really winning this war. There ain't going to be a Germany and Japan when this is done. This is going to be, Henry Luce said it, and I guess it's 42. This is going to be the American century. So what happens? Henry Wallace, the vice president, he actually makes a very important speech in 42 where he says, no, this should be the century of the common man. It's the complete opposite of the CFR vision of a post-World War II world dominated by US banking and finance and corporate capital. Anyway, they know I think they know from then they're getting rid of Wallace, which they do. You know, Vice President Wallace essentially got rid of in a coup in, in 44, and they bring in Truman, and then FDR is part of this. The FDR dies and Truman becomes president. Anyway, when they realize in 1942 there's going to be the atomic bomb, now they understand, hold on here. We're the only ones that are going to have the bomb. This post-World War II world, this ain't going to be a normal post-World War II. This is going to be the American century. And you know what that is? The bomb and Bretton Woods. We're going to construct the financial architecture of the non-Soviet world. And we're going to make sure that everything is part of this American century. We'll try to roll back. We will try to undo the Soviets. But we are not going to let socialism spread anywhere else, whatever it takes. And that's the actual Council on Foreign Relations plan as it develops. They keep they have 100 of these people on the committee. They have all these subcommittees creating reports, and they keep handing all this stuff over to the State Department, which goes through it and sends it as recommendations to FDR. And so the post-World War world is essentially worked out by the Rockefeller money and this alliance of corporate lawyers and academics. And essentially what they planned is what happened. The thing that developed more was when they get to the end of World War II, and they look around, they say, holy shit, we built out this enormous aerospace industry. What are we going to do now? So Lockheed Martin's on the verge of, it's not Martin, it's Lockheed at that time. Lockheed's on the verge of going bankrupt. Bell Aircraft, go through it, all the big military contractors, especially in aerospace. They don't have a market anymore because the market was all guaranteed government purchases. So where are we going to get? How do we keep this going? And the answer is simple. We need a goddamn good enemy. And then we'll be able to keep it going. And so they absolutely make up this whole fiction that the Soviet Union was planning to invade Western Europe, and first chance it gets, it's going to attack the United States. And we go, and now we're off to the races. Now we have the Cold War. And between 1946 and 1923, three, I think was the number I saw. Three times the amount of all the federal spending on infrastructure, highways, bridges, everything. Money transferred to states for infrastructure. Three times that was spent on developing nuclear weapons. It was a boondoggle.
Wow,
We're
look,
still living in the days of the boondoggle. Of course, the latest one will be the Iron Dome, the Iron Con, which my line is, it's not about the dome, it's about the gold.
wow. And I just have a nuclear head emoji erupting out of my mind because what an amazing analysis, Paul. I mean, sorry for the pun, but look, I cannot wait to see how this rolls out. But I just want to, offer a little bit of commentary about where my mind went during that dissertation. My God, first of all, finance and Wall Street and slave trade. The first thing that when I was getting my head around all of the elements that created the 2008 great financial crisis, and I was looking into financial, innovation and the derivatives and all of these other elements, it took the 1619 project for whatever controversy that had to make me understand, oh, wait a second, collateralized debt obligations and derivatives and all of these other kind of things that are exactly what I'm looking at in, between, I'm going to call it 2016, 2020, took place during the slave trade. And that's what financed it. And now, another thing you mentioned, the Rockefellers. I have a colleague that I interact with out of Alberta.
Let me just add one thing to reinforce what you're saying. One of the good businesses Wall Street did with the slave trade is insuring the slaves. They made money out of selling insurance to the plantation owners.
Right. Well, but my mind also goes to the original predatory lending scenario under sharecropping, which is kind of like a very early version of what ultimately takes place and what we see transpire with predatory lending and liars loans. But just a quick aside, the nature of this relationship I have with a colleague out of Alberta who's taught me about the Rockefeller influence and many things that came downstream that would actually guarantee, he's laid out how, basically Alberta is a province of the United States and that all of the tar sands and the future revenue was very integral to Wall Street's sort of booking, future revenue from the tar sands into what would ultimately become the housing market. Don't know if that's a stretch for you, but I do find it interesting that Rockefeller seems to be in a very intrinsic piece of that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, after World War II, and you get into, the next big thing after the Industrial Revolution is the digital revolution, and it changes a lot. It takes all these practices of Wall Street and puts them on steroids.
Right.
I once sat down with a broker who was he was a Wall Street guy during the 1960s, and he says, "Do you realize we used to have to do all this with a pencil and paper?"
Right.
And he said to me, imagine doing subprime with a pencil and paper. You can't do it. So the digital revolution, computers, and all the rest, it took everything that was already essentially there and exploded it into a completely different scale. So financialization of the economy took off like a rocket.
Well, and you validate what we put in our trailer for the con because that's what Bill Black says is this is the largest criminal racketeering effort in the history of the world. And to your point, there's been plenty of bad things that have happened in the past, just not with the speed, just not with all of the different technical, capacity to do this. But, on this Labor Day, I'll make this point, and this is where I ended up, with everything moving forward. But it just undergirds everything you're talking about, particularly with the nuclear power is sort of the thumbprint of it all. The way I interpret this is that after the 2008 great financial crisis, obviously we did extraordinary scenarios to maneuver the full faith and credit of the United States to float the financial system that was involved with the largest racketeering effort in the history of the world. That was actually negotiated by none other than a gentleman by the name of Raj Cohen, who was a general managing partner of none other than Sullivan and Cromwell, which I found very fascinating. And in his testimony to the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, he admitted that it was the level and the depths of the derivatives that they had no idea how deep the carnage went. And so they utilized Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to provide the exigent lending. But in the statutes, I found out later, Paul, and it's pretty simple to understand how this was actually, figured out. But during the time of Glass-Steagall and the investigation by none other than Ferdinand Pecora that would lead to the SEC and the SEC Act and all of those other elements. Of course, they looked at the private-public partnership through exigent lending in extreme circumstances, but in the statute itself, it says you can't use the full faith and credit of the United States to be able to float any sorts of commodities trading, let alone real estate. It says that in the statutes. How do you think it's possible no one knows that or stopped it? I'm just curious, just based on your nuance, your intelligence, what you've seen, your wisdom. I mean, you've seen this over and over. It's a rhetorical question, but I'm curious how you answer that.
Well, it's the same reason they, rolled back Glass-Steagall. What the digital revolution did is it shifted even more power to finance. And so it's more or less around the time of the Clinton administration, it really asserts itself, although it really takes off under Reagan. But the idea that the state, the government, was there to try to moderate the excesses of capitalism, was there to try to make sure that especially the banks, like there's an amazing speech, a letter FDR sends to Congress in 1938 called On Monopoly. And he says if one section of capital gets control of the state, the federal government, it will be the American definition of fascism. That's FDR's words. Well, that's been a process that's been unfolding. And as I say, with the digital revolution, then Reaganism was essentially the real coming to power without any mitigation of finance and militarization. And of course, what's happened now, especially since 07-08, because one of the products of the crash of 07-08 was the emergence of the big asset management firms, BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, because it was so volatile, what had happened in 07-08, it scared the hell out of pension funds and all kinds of sovereign wealth funds and even big multimillionaires and whatever. They didn't want to get caught again. And when they looked at who actually was able to survive 07-08 without getting cream, it was Vanguard. And you buy the entire stock exchange and you mitigate your risk. So even if the thing tanks, you're going to come back one way or another. So these big asset management firms become the Goliaths of Wall Street. Well, just to get back where I was, who do you think owns, most of what the companies that make nuclear weapons? It's these asset management firms. And they don't aggressively manage them. They claim to be passive, but they get to decide who the board of directors are. They vote proxies for all the people. If you give your money to Vanguard or BlackRock, your pension money or personal money, they get to vote your proxy. So they have enormous clout in these companies. And the problem, what's happened now, is the merger of financialization and militarization. In other words, Wall Street essentially owns the arms manufacturers. That doesn't mean they don't have their own individual billionaires and characteristics, but underpinning it all is finance. So let's get back to your question. Why did these regulatory authorities and legislation get overturned? Because finance wants it. They own Congress, and there's still there's a little bit of pushback occasionally, but what they've been undermining. So why was there a New Deal? I see your thing about a clean New Deal. Well, why was there originally a New Deal? Because FDR and a certain section of capital were smart enough to realize if you don't have a social safety net, if you don't push back on the power of the banks, capitalism itself is going to be threatened. And they believed, I believe FDR believed, that you could kind of mitigate it and let it be not such a malignant system, and it would survive. The problem is that ain't the way capitalism works. And eventually, when the war was over, it asserted itself, which is Wall Street and other sectors of capital, They don't want the state telling them what to do. Even if it's good for the system, they don't give a shit about the system. They give a shit about their own pocketbooks. It's Bill's thing. Bill Black, when he said, when he would say, Paul, it's not about the banks, it's about the bankers. But that goes for the whole bloody system. It's not just the banks. They don't even really care about the capitalist system if they're making off like bandits for now. So the role of government trying to regulate has been their enemy, except for a small section of capital that understands, wait a sec, you do need some breaks, or you're going to get more 07, 08s. Well, now you got Trump. Now the people who don't want any breaks, now that cabal is in power. So there's going to be no breaks on banking, no breaks on the development of artificial intelligence, no breaks on the weaponization of space. I mean, the every rational force within the capitalist system has been defeated, and the fucking crazies have taken over the nut house.
Right, which is by design, as we both know, through Project 2025 and all of these diabolical billionaires that have, fomented the technocrats throughout the whole time.
Can I just disagree with one thing? I wouldn't even call them diabolical. They are the natural product of a system that inevitably concentrates ownership in fewer and fewer hands, and thus concentrates power in fewer and fewer hands. So diabolical sounds like somehow they've come up with some alchemy that's doing this. No. They're not the bastards of the system. They're legitimate children of this system.
Well, I agree, but like I always say, greed is a disease, right, of misery, but it's not illegal. Control fraud is, racketeering is, and their methodologies of deception through the falsification of business records that we saw play out in the 34 felony convictions of Trump. Guilty 34 times, which are great, but
we don't know what's illegal anymore because
well, I know I'm aware of that.
Like now, what is illegal now? I don't know
exactly. But see, you just made my point, because this is really, and I'm just so amazed by this dialogue, because first and foremost, activist investors, to your point, right? Guys like Paul Singer and what you're talking about, that's freaking monopoly, first and foremost, right? And Bill always talks about now, we can't just have the No Kings rally. We have to have the No Robber Barons initiative, right? And so we've developed a platform to be able to develop that. But my work has revealed, and what it taught me, which echoes and parallels everything that you're talking about here, is the nature of just its definitions, okay? I agree with everything you've said, but I would suggest that we have to change definitions. Capitalism suggests risk reward. It doesn't suggest, it demands it. That's the name and the nature of capitalism. We're not dealing with that. We're dealing with a sure thing. I say we don't have capitalism.
Who says that's what capitalism is? Where do you get that risk reward?
Okay, can we debate that? Let me see if I can make this point and see if this resonates first, because I'm curious to see how you might respond to it. So, same with democracy in terms of nuances, because we're certainly not a democracy. I say we're a corporate fascist state, which is redundant for a reason. But the reality is that it's undergirded by a criminal syndicate. It literally is a criminal syndicate by definition. And to your point, that's the whole purpose of Trump and the Project 2025 is to redefine racketeering, quite frankly, which we can now see naked. I call them the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid, being Trump, Don the Con, Rico Pig. I mean, literally, it's ridiculous the amount of theft that's already taken place in the first 6 months. But when you carry that forward, and same with the notion of socialism, for example, in this respect, right? And I understand collectivism and the nature of, how certain countries do certain things. And I also understand the nature of a hybrid system, and I believe in social democracy. But the problem for me has been watching this thing unravel since 9/11, is no one is willing to take on the corruption. And to your point, the corruption gets worse and worse and worse. And it's that age-old adage of the frog that gives the ride across the river to the scorpion, because he falls for it and he gets stung to death and they both drown. If we don't force the law and accountability, with investigations, which of course the Supreme Court has basically wiped out. Now we have a completely corrupt FBI. I mean, it's insane what we're looking at, but at the same time, based on what you're suggesting and what we've seen throughout the last 25 years, to me, it's completely expected. And the final piece of that is it's socialism, literally, because the full faith and credit of the United States has been provided illegally. Illegally, I'm not kidding. In the statutes, it says you cannot provide exigent lending in extreme circumstances. Although I'm sure Bill Black might have something to say about this, that's far beyond my knowledge. But from what I can see, based on speculations in commodities, particularly real estate. So if you provide tens of trillions of dollars to a system through insider trading and all of the other methodologies that we've seen since the 80s, right? There's a reason they called it a predator's ball with the likes of Michael Milken, who was engaged with whom? Donald Trump. Where? Atlantic City. Through what? Savings and loan, through junk bonds. All of that was the first sort of domino that would lead to, and this is something I found out recently too from a Russian, actually it was Ukrainian, I'm sorry, Ukrainian guest of mine. And I posed this question to him. I said, do you think Putin was playing the long game after the destruction of the ruble currency in 1998 because of the derivatives of the long-term capital management gamble? And he said, no, you've got it wrong. Putin was in on it. So the global oligarchy, in context to genocide and everything else, what we've seen 9/11 forward, and we've only got a few minutes left, and I hope you can take us home, from nuclear Armageddon to crisis, environmental crises, humanitarian crisis, but really it's a crisis for me of shall we say, sophistication by people who could vote up until the last election, which now I don't think we're going to see a free and fair election again. All of that being equal, is this not the exact result, given what you've been in the midst of for your entire career, that we should, this is the expectation? To what end? What comes next, my man?
Well, I think there's only one way out of this. I think the days of regulation being able to mitigate this, even though I don't think it was ever very effective, the dispossession of most people took place even during times there was relatively more regulation. But I think we've reached a stage of this system. It's worse in the US. It's pretty bad in Russia. Anyway, it's a global system. And what the US is the manager of this global system. It's reached a point now where the parasitism of the financial sector, so much money is involved in unproductive speculation. The financial architecture of the world, to use the analogy, is a financial nuclear bomb waiting to go off. There is so much smoke and mirrors. There is such a grab. I mean, you got a president who, after getting elected, starts issuing his own Bitcoin and Bibles. And I mean, it's like the vulgarity of the con is so apparent, and it seems to make little difference for half of the population for some reason. I think that's going to change, because I think...
And they're the ones suffering the most.
Yeah. So I think there's only one way out. You cannot try to... I mean, I'm happy if some sect people want to fight for regulation and do this and do that. It's not going to change much. What's the only thing that's going to change much is some form of public ownership that's democratic. And it has to start in banking, whether it's at the level of cities or states. It's pretty hard to do anything nationally. But in states, the North Dakota Public Bank has some merit. One can look at, there's other examples of co-ops and whatever. We've got to wean certainly governments off Wall Street as much as possible. It's not easy, because sometimes these financial flows are very big, but some of the big states have the capacity for it. California and Illinois and New York. And maybe what's happening with Trump now, he's going to push these states further into rethinking just what kind of world are we living in here. But public ownership, one of banking, with democratic forms of control, we absolutely have to demand public ownership of artificial intelligence, or we're fucked, excuse the language. AI in the hands of for-profit Silicon Valley does only two things: militarize and become even more of a surveillance state. That is going to lead us to doom, not the least of which is not only are the leaders of AI telling us that AI sooner than later is going to become kind of autonomous in a way. They actually, even some of the people like Schmidt and others, I mean, leading minds of AI are actually talking about AI could decide at some point the best way to carry out its mission is without humans. So just on itself, it's an issue. And I'm very pro AI. I really do believe publicly owned AI is part of the solution, because now we can have a decentralized planned economy that never could have existed before, but only if it's publicly owned and democratically controlled. At any rate, you need public banking, you need public AI, and you have to have a real mass movement. We got to wake people up because the threat is so existential. And it's not just about nuclear weapons. Imagine the world at 3 degrees warming, 4 degrees warming. We may see 2 degrees, apparently, according to Hansen, a lot of credible people, is already baked in. Like, we're already heading to 2, maybe within less than 10 years. By 2050, we could easily be at 3, and some people even say north of 3. Imagine that world and what it means in terms of the potential for war. India and Pakistan out of water. Most of the agriculture of Midwestern United States, goodbye. Most of the peoples of the south of the equator have to start trying to move north, massive migration. So within that context, now take the American-China rivalry in the context. At 3 and 4 degrees, something like half of China becomes unlivable. They lose tons of their agriculture. Like the world we are heading into, not is it just civilizationally threatening just on the basis of climate, but add what climate does to the potential for miscalculation, error, and causing a nuclear war. I mean, we're heading into total bonkers land. Nobody, I can't say nobody, almost nobody is talking about this. So you want me to take you home, just to end with, we got to get past language like corruption. Of course it's corruption. I mean, corruption, like I gave you that example of JP Morgan and the rifles. It's at the heart. You can't even talk about this system without corruption. It's at the core of it. But corruption sounds like it's solvable if you could just make these bad actors, let's catch them, let's put them in jail or something. That doesn't happen. The only thing that saves us is, one, some section of the elites wake up and realize they're going to get wiped out. You ain't surviving a nuclear war. I don't care what bloody dome you think you're going to build. You're not even going to survive climate crisis. Go build old silos and build your $50 million under the ground bunkers. Well, you'll die there. You should make sure you have coffins in those bunkers and places to put them, because that's where you're going to end up. So maybe some sections of the elites wake up and realize, as FDR had a section of elites that realized, this is going to get us too. But more importantly, ordinary people like us, we need to demand these changes. We can't vote for anybody that doesn't have a program to mitigate the risk of nuclear war, be serious about the climate crisis, and start really focusing on certain issues like public banking at state levels, city levels, turning existing co-ops into public banks or give them more scale. Weaken the power of Wall Street, because unless you have a real wave, and this is not out of the question, a wave of candidates who are willing to start passing serious laws to restrict the power of Wall Street. But more importantly than that, because that's going to be really hard, creating real national public banking. So we can say, go speculate all you want, except next time you crash, go fuck yourself, because we're not bailing you out.
I love it. I love it. I was trying to think about BRICS earlier today, and I think the cryptocurrency deal is a whole other next level conversation based on that. And I agree with everything you said, and thank you, because that really is, and it wasn't my intent. But if I can get to my premise, the Clean New Deal, because of everything you said, and I'm just going to give you this on the way out, and our audience and everything else. But I would agree with you about the corruption statement. But Paul, corruption burns and fuels fascism. And we know what happens when you got a fascist outcome. Everybody's screwed, okay? And I think there's still millions of us that are not going to tolerate that. And it's, again, not May Day today, it's Labor Day. And so people need to understand that the level of sociopathy and criminality and just viciousness by this financial class who literally doesn't give a you know what about anyone but their own control. I liken it to, in fact, I've always called it financial terrorism, Paul. And to bring us back to our 9/11 conversation, to put the people in the picture, what do you do when you're on that airplane flying towards the Twin Towers? Do you sit on your hands and let it happen, or do you take control, regardless of what you think the outcome is? And what we've developed, and I think this is the bridge, because based on what you've said, it seems to me like we either die completely or there's a revolution of some sort, or if people, millions, could wake up, you got to understand the perversion of power, the lies of language, the deception of the system. And when you have the truth, you're bulletproof, Paul. And that's when you become, to use a nuclear reference in a positive way, I try to encourage people to become a nuclear reaction vector to the big bang of truth that we're talking about. Because once you understand how this system works, of course you can fix the system. But the question is, what is it going to take to do that? What is going to be the downside of that? And we've seen throughout history that it wasn't as global and connected with as big of weapons as you've mentioned, not to mention the hydrogen bomb. Obviously, millions and millions and millions of people have died in the history, in this struggle, which means what now? More to come. So people, thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe and share. Please check out Paul Jay's work. I'll include a description, obviously, down below to everything that you've mentioned today. I can't wait to see the documentary on Ellsberg and what that means. But boy, does it sound comprehensive. Is it going to premiere at Hot Docs, by the way?
I don't know. Actually, it's coming out this early spring of 2027. We're hoping to premiere it maybe at the Cannes Festival.
Wow.
And then open theatrically everywhere.
Fantastic.
It's narrated by Emma Thompson.
Really? Wow. Good for you. That came through, and I am so excited for you and everything else. Can't wait to see it. And also, everybody, please check out Paul's collective work. Also, check out thenewuntouchables.com. Please check out thecleannewdeal.org. And of course, you can check out the blueprint of it all at thecon.tv. It was really nice to reconnect with you, Paul. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thanks a lot, Patrick. Okay, hang on. I'm going to stop the recording.